We can teach creativity. People can be more creative than they currently are. And through a means of inquiry, where they are active participants rather than passive passengers, then in fact they really develop that skill set to think, to analyze.
Inquiry-based learning techniques have proven to be highly effective in nurturing and developing creativity and critical thinking in students. Inquiry-based learning requires students to draw on and develop their own abilities to solve problems and discover answers for themselves rather than relying on teachers to supply the facts.
We have this standard top-down role, right? The professor is the brilliant person in the front of the class who dictates, and the students quickly, write their notes and try to plumb the depths of the brilliant professor, right? And this turns that all on its head.
IBL teachers facilitate the learning process rather than disseminate information in a traditional lecture setting.
What it's not all about is somebody standing in front of the classroom explaining mathematics. What it is all about is someone saying a very few words to get you started thinking on your own.
The teacher's job in an inquiry-based learning environment is therefore not to deliver facts, but instead to help students along the process of discovering knowledge for themselves.
The student is on a discovery path. In fact, we like to use that sometimes and call it a discovery method.
But emphasis on traditional lecture styles of teaching in America has had disappointing results. In a recent international study comparing teenagers' performance on a standardized mathematics exam, 15-year-olds in the U.S. ranked only 24th out of 30 of the world's most affluent countries.
It's not really that lecture prohibits construction of ideas. A lecture may reach a handful who might be at just the right moment to hear what it is that's being said. If we don't lecture and we do something else, that something else should be designed so that as many people as possible in the room can be engaged and get something out of that experience. The thing is, lecture usually just doesn't do that.
But there is a growing community of educators, teachers that are making dramatic changes in their classrooms and in the lives of their students.
Does somebody have a proof of that? Okay, Tracy?
I see students every single semester come up to me and say, this was the most important class I've taken in college. They said it this semester.
Teachers who make use of inquiry-based learning have found that their students are more likely to remember concepts that they discover on their own rather than memorize information that is recited to students in traditional lecture settings.
I had a student who had some ideas about a particular problem we were discussing as a group, and I failed to just totally give this student the floor, and after class he came up to me and shared, more of the details of what he was thinking, and I just could have shot myself because I thought, how many times is it going to take for me to learn that I really need to shut up and let the students completely have the floor, because so many times they have a much more interesting way of looking at things than I do.
At the end of every semester, they come up and say to me, wow, I never really thought I could do this stuff before, but this has really changed my mind about math. And, I think maybe I can do it now.
But they love it. They think this is just the neatest thing in the world. I had one young lady come up to me and she says, before I took this course, I was so scared because I'd never been good at math before. But I have to tell you, I've gotten so much out of this. I'm a much better writer now, and I read things more carefully now.
IBL teachers create carefully structured situations that allow students to solve problems independently by designing ways to prove their own ideas and by relying on their own abilities to find mathematical and scientific truths for themselves.
I'm doing it on my own. That means this knowledge doesn't just come from the sky through the professor and he's the only source of that knowledge. No, I can get to it by myself. And the professor can be a mentor, kind of like a connection, but not the primarily source. That makes me feel good. That makes me more comfortable with my decision that I can teach math. I can do math. Not just there's a certain group of people who can. Anybody can.
So to them, it's like they're pushing forward the frontiers of truth or something. They really feel like they've got some stake in human knowledge now that they wouldn't have had if we had just lectured to them.
But inquiry-based learning is not a new and trendy educational fad. This educational movement continues a long and time-tested legacy of teaching that was pioneered by a mathematics professor in Texas named Robert L. Moore.
R.L. Moore was the founder of a branch of mathematics, point-set topology, which in itself would give him a place in history. He's become even better known as a teacher of mathematicians. He developed a way of teaching which he was able to bring students up to a kind of research level in mathematics almost without them being aware of it.
Beginning in 1911 as a professor of mathematics at the University of Pennsylvania, Moore began to experiment with his classroom teaching style. It was at Pennsylvania that Moore first adopted the basic principles of his radically new instructional method that he would fully implement at his next appointment, the University of Texas at Austin, where he would remain for the next 49 years. Inspired by his success, other teachers in the mathematics department at Texas, especially H.J. Ettlinger and H.S. Wall, developed their own versions of Moore's teaching method, which also became known as the Texas Method. Moore and his colleagues, through successive generations of students, would eventually lead to nearly 3,000 PhDs, many of whom were profoundly influenced by this IBL technique.
It resulted in probably the most distinguished group of PhD students that any professor has ever had to their credit, not just in the United States, but perhaps in the history of mathematics.
They would eventually change the very face of mathematics. 3 of Moore's PhD students would become presidents of the American Mathematical Society. 5 would become presidents of the Mathematical Association of America.
3 of his students were members of the National Academy of Sciences, as he himself was, and that too is a record that, as far as I know, hasn't been matched. So by these various criteria, R.L. Moore has always had a rather towering position in the history of American mathematics. But in terms of trying to prove the success of a method of teaching, the ultimate measure is the success of the students.
When I entered the university, I had no intention, at least none known to me, of being a mathematician. I entered a summer course for freshman algebra, and the instructor didn't show up. But who do you suppose was there? R.L. Moore. He put some problems on the board and said, I would like to see whether you can solve these problems. That day had a profound influence on my life. That one contact with Moore, just difficult to express the kind of experience this was. I was in effect offered a surgical residency, which I really found it hard to turn down, but there was more. I just had to come back to graduate school. I got a doctorate under Dr. Moore's direction at that point.
Worrell joined a research team at Sandia Laboratories. It was there that he derived a controversial solution to a problem which was critical to NASA's launch of the Viking Mars probes.
I think I would have been a successful physician and probably had what some people would consider a very fine career had I not met Moore. But it's a whole different world which I entered into after I met Moore.
In 1952, here he came in the calculus class, and it was really quite an experience. It was a transforming experience. My whole intellectual and professional life, I built on it very naturally. I've got 27 PhD students, and I've got 65 descendants. I published maybe 4 papers my first 6 years. 3 of them founded a new field of mathematics.
A large number of influential teachers, top researchers, inventors, and leaders of industry can attest to the life-changing rewards that began for them in a classroom taught by IBL and the Moore method.
It was magic. It's hard to describe how magic it is. Every one of us changed the way we thought about the world and the way we thought about ourselves.
Coke Reed is an inventor and entrepreneur who has developed many of the solutions that allow today's complex networks and interconnected systems to operate smoothly.
He walked in the classroom and he said, these are some definitions, and now I'm going to ask you, can you prove the following statement? And he walked out of the room. The first class lasted maybe 10 minutes. The next class we came back. He said, does anybody have a proof for that theorem? And nobody did. And we went for like 3 weeks where that's all that happened. Then somebody got up and presented something that was incorrect. And pretty soon somebody got something that was correct. You might think there was 3 wasted weeks. But I would say that I learned more mathematics in those 3 weeks than I had in all my education up to that time.
My education had some serious gaps in it.
From the age of 12, Anton Zettel survived 3 years in Tito's death camp, Gakoa, before escaping and emigrating to the United States.
I came from a different culture. I was 20 years old when I graduated from high school, and I barely made it to college. When I did, I had to compete with students who had much, much better backgrounds. But that didn't matter. I was on the same footing with everyone else in class. I felt I had the same tools that they had to work with, and that's my head. I later on became a research mathematician, very active, and basically what I do almost 50 years after this experience is the same as I did then. I tried to learn new things, prove new theorems. For me, this was a life-changing experience. I owe my career as a research mathematician to my Moore method training.
Despite my not being a great student, he had made me think that at least when it came to mathematics, I could do it. And I think that went with me on into the rest of my academic life and to some extent the rest of my life.
You know, it sort of struck me that, well, maybe I can be a creative mathematician too if I have done something that everybody else already knows, but I did it in a different way.
For some students, these are life-changing experiences. I mean, it was for me. And I know I've had students that weren't really that interested in mathematics, and they get into one of these courses and they decide they're going to devote their life to mathematics.
I think if it weren't for the Moore method, I would never have earned a PhD in mathematics because I have so much difficulty sitting through lectures and trying to keep up with things that way.
I learned to be a better mathematician because of that, because I didn't rely on other people's proofs anymore. I checked their proof to see if it was right instead of just accepting it as right. And then for things that had not been proven before, I felt like it was under my control to decide whether these things were true or false. So it made me more confident, I think, as a mathematician.
But those are the courses in which I truly learned what it meant to be a mathematician. And it wasn't just myself, but probably in these classes I was taking as many as half a dozen or more of these students all went on to get doctoral degrees in mathematics. That's the power of the method.
Starting an inquiry-based classroom and the Moore method can be challenging to students and teachers alike, but both student and teacher can greatly benefit from the experience.
They have to get up in front of a class, explain what they're doing. They have to not be afraid of making mistakes because we all make mistakes.
Their proof is very different than a standard mathematician's proof would be because they are just getting started usually. But when it's all there and it's all correct, I mean, they just glow and the whole class gets very excited, yeah. It's an almost intoxicating thing for the students to experience this kind of success. It's dramatic, immediate success.
They can see someone that can't make a complete sentence, then suddenly wake up and just have a completely different look in their eyes. They're just transformed. And then they start getting better and better stuff, and maybe they become the best one in the class. That's totally addictive. If somebody thinks they can do that for people consistently, then what else do they want to do in life?
And if you watch the student, all of a sudden there's some expression that comes over their face, and you sense immediately they understand something that they didn't understand about 2-3 seconds earlier. And they'll say, I see it. And then they leave. And I've said nothing other than, would you write it on the board? And that's such a wonderful feeling that lasts for a few moments as they're leaving the room, and I'm sure it lasts much longer with them.
When you see the kids get engaged and you see them excited and grasp onto a problem and solve something, improve something for themselves, that's as exciting as the first time I got to see the math.
A teacher who is really interested in their students, their primary objectives for their students to learn, can't help but be interested in a method that does exactly that. Gets their students to take more responsibility for their own learning, develops the kind of independence that the students need in order to do that learning. And the end result is what they do learn, they keep with them for a lifetime.
What we have found is that in the 2 years that we've been using this new style with honors calculus, it has truly changed the approach of some of the students in their learning of mathematics.
Paul Sally founded seminars for elementary specialists and mathematics educators and has been widely influential in mathematics education.
The presence of mind of the students who had been in the inquiry-based learning class was considerably higher than that of the other students. They felt very comfortable at the board. They felt very comfortable about discussing particular ideas in front of the class.
Jennifer Christian Smith conducted a research study with an IBL classroom at the University of Texas at Austin.
The project that we did was an investigation of what happens in this Moore method class. Typically in an introduction to proof course, what happens is that induction is introduced as another method of proof alongside the rest of them. In this particular course, it was never introduced, but students started to come up with arguments that were very inductive. And this allowed the instructor to say, well, let's think about this. Can we formalize this in some way?
You carefully design the challenge questions and the challenge theorems so that every day they're confronting a challenge that they can meet and that gets them to think of a new idea. Then they get in the habit of taking an unknown question, something unknown to them, and by thinking about it and by using strategies of investigation that they were developing during the course of this experience, they become more skillful at finding out answers to questions that were unknown to them.
It was very magical to watch, and by the end of a few weeks, the students were very comfortable with induction.
What I do is I actually bus 20 students in from a school system where the students are not performing exceptionally well. And these students were challenging, and they come from some pretty rough places. In the beginning, they were very hesitant about presenting their ideas for fear of being ostracized, As they became more comfortable, they started understanding that, listen, I bring something valuable. And through my discussions, bouncing ideas off of one another, I'm able to actually better understand what I'm doing, helping myself.
There's a whole place and role of reasoning, critical thinking that everybody talks about and not very many people really know how to implement in classrooms. Well, looking at the R.L. Moore method, you have at least one very positive example of doing that. Of not just talking about it, but actually doing it in classes.
Someone once asked Moore, do you really expect that all of your students should become mathematicians, research mathematicians? And his response, I thought, was marvelous. He said, no, but I hope that they all want to become mathematicians.
And I really had no idea what I was getting into. I didn't know what the Moore method was. I didn't know who R.L. Moore was. I didn't know any of that. I didn't even know that there was a different way of teaching besides the traditional lecture method.
Alan Merck is a high school student who has taken a rigorous pre-calculus course taught by the Moore method.
And after hours of work, you finally get it. The pleasure you get, the gratification you get as a student, that's what makes learning great. That's what great students get. And when you get that gratification of learning, you want to work harder on the next year. You want to work twice as hard. And that eventually builds and builds and builds, and eventually you're working hard at everything you do. And you're learning in the process. I mean, that's what I really didn't realize. I didn't realize I was going to remember as much as I did, because I was just saying to myself, all right, I'm accomplishing stuff. I want to accomplish this. I want to accomplish that. And then by the end of the 8 weeks of the course, I'd remembered so much and I understood so much. It was conceptual understanding too. It wasn't facts. It was a conceptual understanding of what I was learning in mathematics.
And it seems to me that that is the way we embed an excitement about learning, an excitement about new ideas, an excitement about viewing things from a different perspective.
The skills you need out there are two very basic skills. One is the ability to solve problems, and one is the ability to communicate. And so all the features that I see as being pertinent to the method are developing one of those two skills.
So I just burst out and I said, well, Mr. Boyd, why won't you just show us how to do it? And he just turned. I mean, you see him right now. He said, Mr. Parker, why should I limit you to what I know?
It seems to me the purpose of education is clearly to make them independent thinkers, to make them be able to take the challenges that they're going to be faced with, which are the challenges that we do not know today. The questions haven't even been asked. And to allow them to have the ability, the confidence, the analytical ability, the critical thinking ability, and the independence in their way of viewing the world to take on those challenges and to find good imaginative solutions to problems that have not yet been posed.
We now face many difficult challenges that will have major consequences, not only in education, but also in the course of our future civilization. Several leading research universities have taken on those challenges by establishing IBL Centers of Education. And nurturing networks of IBL mentors are now assisting teachers in bringing inquiry-based learning and the MORE method to classrooms across the country and around the world. To learn more about these programs and for more information about the MORE method and inquiry-based learning, please call us at 512-469-1700 or visit us on the web.